By the time the coffee hit her white blouse, everyone in Ruthie's diner had already decided to pretend they hadn't seen it. The glass door was still trembling from the morning rush when Officer Daniel Whitaker stepped inside at 6:40 a.m., bringing with him the smell of rain, wet leather, and cold asphalt from Franklin Avenue. Outside, the clouds hung low over the county courthouse 2 blocks away, turning the windows of the diner gray and dull. Inside, the griddle hissed, plates clinked, and the old neon sign above the counter buzzed like it was tired of witnessing the same small cruelties every day. Naomi Brooks sat alone in the corner booth beneath a framed photo of the town's first courthouse, her back straight, her hands wrapped around a plain white mug that had gone lukewarm. She wore no badge, no title, no expensive coat, nothing that announced power. Just a simple navy blazer over a white blouse, a pair of dark slacks, and a sealed manila envelope resting beside her plate like any ordinary piece of paper. She had driven nearly 5 hours through the night to reach Franklin County before sunrise, crossing long stretches of highway while the radio faded in and out between stations. She wanted one quiet breakfast before her first official meeting, one ordinary cup of coffee before the town learned her name. But Franklin had a way of testing people before it welcomed them. Whitaker paused near the entrance, shaking rain from his jacket like he owned the room. Conversations softened without anyone asking them to. Maggie Ellis, the diner's owner, reached for the coffee pot before he even sat down, her movements practiced, careful, almost apologetic. His usual booth was the corner one by the window. Naomi's booth. Whitaker stared at her for a long second, the kind of stare that did not ask a question because it had already decided the answer. "You're in my seat," he said. Naomi looked up slowly. Her eyes were calm, dark, and awake in a way that made the air around her feel still. "I didn't see a name on it," she said. The spoon in Maggie's hand stopped tapping against the counter. A man in a feed store cap lowered his newspaper just enough to watch. Whitaker gave a small smile, thin and humorless, then walked to the table. His uniform was pressed sharp, his badge polished bright under the diner lights, but there was nothing official in the way he leaned over her plate. "This town has rules," he said quietly. "People who just got here ought to learn them before breakfast." Naomi did not move. "Then maybe you should explain them properly." For a moment only the friar spoke. Then Whitaker reached for the tall glass of iced coffee near the edge of her table, lifted it with 2 fingers and tipped it forward. Brown liquid slid down the front of Naomi's blouse, cold enough to make her breath catch, dark enough to bloom across the white fabric in a spreading stain. Ice cubes bounced once against the booth seat and fell to the tile. No one laughed. That was the worst part. No one laughed and still no one stood up. Naomi looked down at the stain, at the slow drip falling from the hem of her blazer onto the floor. Then she lifted a napkin, pressed it once against her sleeve, and raised her eyes back to him. Whitaker expected anger. He expected embarrassment. He expected her to shrink. Instead, she set the wet napkin beside the manila envelope and said very softly, "Officer, you just made this official." Naomi Brooks had learned long ago that silence could be mistaken for weakness by people who had never had to survive inside it. She had grown up 3 states south of Franklin County, in a narrow brick apartment above a laundromat where the dryers shook the floor every evening and her mother came home smelling of coffee, bleach, and fried onions from the late shift at a roadside diner. Her mother, Loretta Brooks, had served men who called her sweetheart without kindness and ma'am without respect. She had carried hot plates past people who looked through her as if she were part of the furniture, then came home and taught Naomi how to hold her chin steady anyway. "Do not let them decide how small you are," she used to say while counting tips at the kitchen table. "Make them meet the full height of you." That sentence followed Naomi through law school, through federal courtrooms, through long nights under fluorescent lights where she built cases from paper trails and witness statements while men with louder voices tried to talk over her. It followed her now, sitting in Ruthie's diner with cold coffee soaked into her blouse and every eye in the room balanced between fear and shame. The man in the feed store cap had stopped pretending to read. A waitress near the pie case held a towel in both hands, frozen there. Maggie Ellis stood behind the counter with her lips parted, her face pale beneath the warm yellow lights. Nobody moved toward Naomi. Nobody moved toward Officer Whitaker either. That was how power worked in small towns when it had gone unchallenged for too long. It trained ordinary people to lower their eyes before they even understood why. Naomi took one slow breath. The coffee was cold against her skin, sticky at her collar, and the scent of roasted beans clung to her like an accusation. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and placed it face up on the table. Not hidden. Not dramatic. Just visible. Whitaker's smile faded a fraction. "You recording me?" he asked. Naomi looked at the polished badge on his chest, then at his face. "I am asking for your name and badge number." A soft sound moved through the diner, not quite a gasp, more like the room inhaling too late. Whitaker let out a short laugh and glanced around, inviting the others to join him. No one did. "You walk into town before sunrise, sit in a booth that everybody here knows is mine, then start making demands?" he said. "That is not how this works." Naomi folded the damp napkin once, then again, until it became a neat square beside her plate. Her hands did not shake. A public business does not become private property, because people are afraid to correct you. Maggie looked down quickly, as if the words had brushed too close to something she had been carrying for years. Whitaker leaned closer, lowering his voice so that it sounded less like anger, and more like a warning meant only for her. "You have no idea who you are talking to." Naomi held his gaze. She thought of the sealed envelope on the table, of the governor's signature inside it, of the oath she would take later that morning in a courtroom 2 blocks away. She thought of every complaint she had reviewed before coming here, every name underlined in red, every story that ended with someone deciding it was safer to stay quiet. Then she said, softly enough that the people nearest her had to lean in to hear it, "No, officer. I think you are the one who has not asked enough questions." Whitaker's face hardened, not all at once but slowly, the way a storm gathers behind a tree line before anybody feels the rain. He straightened from the booth and looked around Ruthie's diner, measuring the room, reminding everyone without words that he knew their names, their license plates, their late-night calls for help, their sons who drove too fast on county roads, their businesses that needed permits renewed. That was the weight he carried into every place in Franklin. Not just a badge but memory, favors, fear, and the quiet habit of being obeyed. "Maggie," he called without taking his eyes off Naomi. "You letting strangers come in here and start trouble now?" Maggie Ellis flinched at her own name. She was 61, with silver hair pinned under a faded red scarf and hands rough from 30 years of carrying plates hotter than her palms could bear. Ruthie had been her mother's name before it became the name on the sign, and that sign had survived 2 recessions, 1 kitchen fire, and a highway bypass that stole half the breakfast crowd. It had survived because Maggie knew when to smile, when to nod, and when to pretend she had not heard a cruel thing said 10 feet away. But now Naomi was sitting there soaked and still, and something about her stillness made the old diner feel less safe than honesty. "Officer Whitaker," Maggie said carefully, "maybe we should just let her finish her breakfast." The room shifted. It was not defiance, not yet, but it was the first small crack in the wall. Whitaker turned his head toward her, and the look he gave made the coffee pot tremble slightly in her hand. "I asked you a question." Naomi watched him, studying the performance beneath the uniform. She had seen it before in courtrooms, in depositions, in the polished offices of men who smiled for cameras and threatened people behind closed doors. Power did not always shout. Sometimes it asked a question in a room where everyone already knew the answer it wanted. Across from her, the man in the feed store cap pulled his newspaper higher, but his eyes stayed on the scene over the top edge. Near the back, a young father placed a protective hand over his little boy's shoulder. 2 county clerks at the counter stared down into their plates as if toast had suddenly become fascinating. Naomi understood them more than she judged them. Fear was not always cowardice. Sometimes it was rent due Friday, a sick parent, a business loan, a child applying for a scholarship in a town where one angry officer could make life difficult in 100 invisible ways. Whitaker turned back to her. "You people come into places like this thinking respect is something you can demand." Naomi's fingers rested beside her phone. Her voice stayed even. "Respect is not the issue. Conduct is." His mouth tightened. That word landed differently, like it belonged in a file, not a diner. He glanced at the manila envelope beside her plate, then at the phone again. "You some kind of lawyer?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She picked up the envelope and moved it away from the wet edge of the table, careful not to let the coffee reach the seal. "I am a customer," she said. And you are a public servant. A silence followed so complete that the neon sign seemed louder. Whitaker gave a cold little smile. Public servant, he repeated, as if the words tasted wrong. That is cute. Then he reached toward the table, not touching her, just close enough to make the gesture feel like possession, and slid her untouched plate a few inches away from her. Breakfast is over. Naomi looked at the plate, then back at him. The old fear in the room leaned forward, waiting for her to finally gather her things and leave. Instead, she remained seated, shoulders square, coffee drying dark against her blouse, and spoke with the same quiet precision. No, Officer Whitaker. What is over is the assumption that no one will write this down. Naomi's words did not rise above the hum of the refrigerator case, yet they reached every corner of the diner as if someone had turned up the volume on the truth. Officer Whitaker stood beside her booth with one hand resting near his belt, his shoulders squared toward the room, his jaw set in the familiar shape of a man who believed anger could pass for authority. For a second he did nothing. Then he leaned closer, close enough that Naomi could smell rainwater on his jacket and the sharp mint of gum on his breath, but not close enough to make her move. You are going to teach me about assumptions now? He asked. Naomi folded her hands on the table, careful, steady, deliberate. No. I am giving you an opportunity to correct the record before it becomes someone else's job. The phrase touched something raw in him. His eyes flicked again to the phone, then to the manila envelope, then to Maggie behind the counter. The envelope bothered him more than he wanted to admit. It did not look expensive, but it looked official. It sat on the table with the quiet confidence of a locked door. Name and identification, he said suddenly. Naomi looked up. On what legal basis? That question changed the air. It was not loud. It was not rude. It was simply too precise. The county clerks at the counter stopped pretending not to listen. One of them, a thin man with a courthouse lanyard tucked into his shirt pocket, turned his head just slightly. Whitaker noticed. He always noticed who was watching. You are disturbing the peace, he said. Naomi glanced around the silent diner. The peace was disturbed before I spoke. A faint sound escaped the young father near the back. Not quite a laugh, more like surprise slipping through his teeth before he could stop it. Whitaker's head turned toward him, and the man immediately looked down at his son's crayons. Fear returned to the room like a draft under the door. Naomi felt it too, but fear had never been an instruction to obey. She reached for a clean napkin and wiped a thin line of coffee from the edge of the table, not because she owed the room tidiness, but because her mother had taught her that dignity sometimes lived in small motions. When the world tried to make you look broken, you straightened what you could reach. Maggie, Naomi said without taking her eyes off Whitaker, does your security system record the dining area? Maggie froze. The old wall clock above the pie case ticked once, twice, 3 times. Whitaker turned slowly toward the counter. Do not answer that. Maggie's fingers tightened around the handle of the coffee pot. She looked at Naomi, then at the dark stain across the woman's blouse, then at the small puddle spreading under the booth where ice was melting on the tile. Her voice came out thin, but it came out. Yes. Something passed through the diner then, not courage exactly, but the memory of it. Naomi nodded once. Please preserve the footage from 6:35 onward. Whitaker gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You do not give orders here. Naomi's expression did not change. I am making a request to a witness. The word witness landed harder than any insult could have. It turned the diner from a room full of frightened customers into a room full of people who had seen something. Whitaker understood that instantly. His face shifted, the confidence still there, but now with a thin seam of calculation beneath it. Stand up, he said. Naomi remained seated. Am I being detained? He stared at her. Stand up. Am I free to leave? The courthouse clerk at the counter swallowed visibly. Maggie set the coffee pot down with a soft glass click. Whitaker's voice dropped. You are making this worse for yourself. Naomi rose slowly from the booth, not because he had won, but because she wanted everyone to see she was not afraid to stand at her full height. The coffee stain ran from her collar to her waist like a bruise made of liquid, but her posture made it seem less like humiliation and more like evidence. No, Officer Whitaker, she said. You are The room held its breath as Naomi Brooks stood beside the booth, coffee cooling against her blouse, her phone still lying face up on the table like a small black mirror. Officer Whitaker looked at her the way men like him looked at anyone who refused to bend on command, with surprise first, then irritation, then the need to turn that irritation into a lesson. He reached for the radio clipped near his shoulder and pressed the button. Unit 12 requesting a transport at Ruthie's Diner, he said. His voice suddenly polished, official, made for records. Possible disorderly conduct. Subject refusing to comply. The words were clean. That was what made them dangerous. Naomi knew how language could launder a moment, how a report could turn spilled coffee into a misunderstanding, a witness into a suspect, a public insult into a line about attitude. She did not interrupt him. She watched. Maggie's face tightened behind the counter. The young father pulled his son closer, not from Naomi, but from the feeling that the room had slipped into something larger than breakfast. The little boy stared at the melting ice near Naomi's shoes and whispered, "Daddy, why did he do that?" No one answered him. Whitaker lowered his radio and turned back to Naomi. "Hands where I can see them." Naomi slowly lifted both hands, palms open, visible to everyone. "I am not resisting you," she said. "I am asking again. Am I under arrest or am I being detained?" The courthouse clerk at the counter closed his eyes for a moment, as if he knew the question mattered and feared what the answer would cost. Whitaker stepped closer, careful now, aware of the witnesses, aware of the phone, aware of the camera Maggie had admitted existed. "You are coming with me until I decide what you are." Naomi almost smiled, not because anything was funny, but because the sentence revealed more than he understood. Outside, tires hissed over wet pavement. A second patrol car pulled up to the curb, its lights turning the diner windows red and blue in soft, silent pulses. The colors moved across Naomi's stained blouse, across Maggie's silver hair, across the framed courthouse photograph on the wall. For one strange second, the whole diner looked underwater. The second officer who entered was younger, no more than 27, with rain on his sleeves and uncertainty in his eyes. His name tag read Parker. He looked from Naomi to Whitaker to the coffee on the floor, and his face tightened in confusion. "What happened?" he asked. "She caused a disturbance," Whitaker said too quickly. Naomi turned her head toward Officer Parker. The camera above the register recorded the interaction. So did the people in this room. Parker's gaze moved upward to the small black security camera tucked into the corner near the pie case. Whitaker noticed and snapped, "Do not start auditing me in public." Parker looked down. That was another kind of silence, Naomi thought. Not agreement. Survival. Whitaker took out a set of cuffs, holding them low at his side. He did not wave them. He did not need to. The metal caught the light anyway. A thin murmur passed through the room. Maggie stepped out from behind the counter before she seemed to realize her feet had moved. "Daniel," she said, and the use of his first name made everyone look at her. "This does not have to go that far." Whitaker turned on her, his face flushed now. "Stay out of police business, Maggie." Her shoulders folded inward, but she did not step back. Naomi saw the cost of that single inch of courage. It made her voice gentler when she spoke. "Maggie, please remember what time he came in." Maggie nodded once, her eyes shining. 6:40. Maybe a minute after. "And the footage?" Naomi asked. Maggie swallowed. "I will save it." Whitaker's patience broke into something colder than shouting. "That is enough." He moved behind Naomi and secured the cuffs around her wrists, not roughly, but with the practiced finality of a man used to ending conversations with procedure. The metal was cold against her skin. The diner blurred for a heartbeat, not from fear exactly, but from the old memory of every person who had ever been made small in front of a room and expected to carry the shame alone. Naomi did not lower her head. As Whitaker guided her toward the door, she turned slightly toward the customers, toward Maggie, toward the boy holding his crayon in midair, and said clearly, "Do not let anyone tell you this was ordinary." Then the bell above Ruthie's door gave a tiny, trembling ring as she stepped out into the wet Franklin morning. The ride to the Franklin Police Department lasted less than 7 minutes, but Naomi felt every second of it in the cold circle of metal around her wrists and the damp fabric clinging to her back. Rain tapped softly against the patrol car. windows, blurring the diner behind them until Ruthie's became only a smear of yellow light in the rearview mirror. Officer Whitaker drove without speaking. Officer Parker sat in the passenger seat, shoulders stiff, eyes forward, his silence heavier than apology and weaker than courage. Naomi watched the town pass by in muted pieces, the hardware store with flags in the window, the pharmacy sign blinking open, the courthouse dome rising beyond the trees like a promise waiting to be tested. She had planned to walk through those courthouse doors that morning in a clean blouse, carrying the sealed envelope from the governor's office and a speech about fairness, accountability, and public trust. Instead, she entered Franklin's justice system through the back door of a police station, coffee-stained, handcuffed and unnamed by choice. Inside, the lobby smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and paper warmed by old machines. A dispatcher looked up, saw Whitaker, then saw Naomi, and her expression moved quickly from curiosity to discomfort. Whitaker guided Naomi past the front desk toward a small holding room with pale walls and a metal bench bolted to the floor. "Sit," he said. Naomi sat. The cuffs were removed after a few minutes, leaving red marks around her wrists, not deep, not dramatic, just visible enough to tell the truth without needing to exaggerate it. Whitaker placed a form on a clipboard and began writing. His pen moved with confidence, shaping the morning into his version of events. Disorderly conduct, refusal to comply, creating a disturbance. Naomi watched the words appear upside down from across the room. Each one felt like a fresh coat of paint over a cracked wall. "You are very calm," he said without looking up. "That usually means people are planning something." Naomi looked at her hands. Her mother's voice returned, quiet as steam from a kitchen sink. "Make them meet the full height of you." "No," Naomi said. "It usually means they know the difference between fear and strategy." Whitaker paused, then kept writing. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, turning the room briefly blue-white, then steady again. Water dripped from the hem of Naomi's blazer onto the floor in small patient drops. Outside the room, phones rang, keyboards clicked, radios murmured in clipped voices. Life continued around the humiliation as if humiliation were just another sound in the building. Naomi breathed in slowly. The air tasted metallic and cold. She thought of the complaints she had read before dawn, names and dates and careful descriptions from people who had been told they misunderstood what happened to them. She thought of Maggie saving the footage with trembling hands. She thought of the little boy in the diner asking why, and how no adult in the room had found an answer brave enough for him. If this moment touched your heart, remember Naomi not as a woman who was powerless, but as a woman choosing not to waste her strength on panic. Sometimes dignity is not a speech. Sometimes it is sitting upright under a hard light while someone tries to rename your pain as disorder. Officer Parker appeared at the doorway, holding Naomi's purse and the sealed manila envelope in an evidence bag he had not yet closed. His eyes lingered on the official seal. "Officer Whitaker," he said carefully, "you may want to look at this." Whitaker did not turn around at first. "Put it with her property." Parker swallowed. "Sir, I really think you need to look at it now." The room went very still. Whitaker finally lifted his head, annoyed, and took the envelope from Parker's hand. The moment he saw the return address from the governor's office, something small but unmistakable shifted in his face. Not regret. Not yet. Recognition trying to outrun fear. Whitaker held the envelope as if its paper had turned warm in his hand. The return address was printed in clean black letters from the office of the governor, and beneath the seal was Naomi's full name, Naomi Elaine Brooks. For the first time since he entered Ruthie's diner, he did not look certain of the room around him. Officer Parker stood near the doorway, quiet but alert, watching the change move across his superior's face. Naomi sat on the metal bench with her back straight, the coffee stain drying darker now, the red marks on her wrists visible under the harsh fluorescent light. Whitaker slid one finger beneath the envelope flap, then stopped. "This is sealed," Naomi said. Her voice was calm, but it carried the kind of authority that did not need volume. "It was sealed when your department took it from me." Whitaker looked up sharply, irritated by the reminder, then lowered his eyes again. The phone on the wall outside the holding room rang once, twice, then a dispatcher answered. Her voice was ordinary at first. Then it changed. "Captain Hayes," she called down the hallway. There is a call from Judge Merritt's chambers. Footsteps moved somewhere beyond the doorway, quick and uneven. Captain Richard Hayes entered a moment later, fastening the top button of his uniform shirt as if he had been pulled from his office too quickly to prepare. He was a broad, gray-haired man with tired eyes and the careful posture of someone who had spent years managing problems instead of solving them. "What is this about?" he asked. Whitaker turned toward him too fast. "Minor situation from Ruthie's." She refused to comply. Naomi watched Captain Hayes glance at the coffee stain, then at the marks on her wrists, then at the envelope in Whitaker's hand. Something in the captain's face tightened before he spoke. "Name." "Naomi Brooks," Parker said before Whitaker could answer. The captain's eyes returned to Naomi. The room seemed to shrink around that name. He took the envelope from Whitaker, saw the seal, and his complexion shifted from annoyance to recognition. "Naomi Elaine Brooks?" he said slowly. Naomi stood. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to make the room understand that the bench had never defined her. "Yes." Captain Hayes swallowed once. The dispatcher appeared behind him, holding the phone away from her ear. "Judge Merritt is asking why the new district attorney is in a holding room." No one moved. Even the radios on nearby desks seemed to quiet under the weight of that sentence. Whitaker's mouth opened, but no words came out with authority attached to them. Parker looked down, then back up, as if relief and fear had arrived at the same time. Captain Hayes turned fully toward Naomi now, and the old habits of command slipped from his face. "Madam, District Attorney," he said, the title sounding too large for the small room and too late for the morning. Whitaker's hand fell away from the clipboard. The report he had been writing sat on the table between them, its neat lines suddenly looking less like a record and more like evidence. Naomi stepped toward it, read the words upside down and then looked at him. "Disorderly conduct," she said softly. "Refusal to comply. Creating a disturbance." She lifted her eyes to Whitaker's. "That is how easy it is it not? A few clean words on a form, and the stain moves from the uniform to the citizen." Whitaker's face drained of color. "I did not know who you were." The sentence landed badly, and everyone in the room seemed to know it. Naomi let the silence hold him there for a moment. "That is not a defense," she said. "It is the problem." Captain Hayes lowered his gaze. Outside the holding room, phones rang again, but no one rushed to answer. The courthouse dome was visible through a narrow window at the end of the hall, pale beneath the clearing sky. Naomi looked toward it, then back at the men standing in front of her. The morning had finally introduced itself. Captain Hayes cleared the holding room before he asked Naomi what she wanted to do. That was the first mistake he made after learning her name, believing this was still a matter of what she wanted rather than what the law required. Officer Parker stepped into the hallway, the dispatcher lowered her eyes, and Whitaker remained near the table with the unfinished report in front of him, his badge catching the fluorescent light in a way that suddenly looked less like honor and more like a question. Naomi did not sit back down. She stood beside the metal bench, coffee drying stiff against her blouse, her wrists bare now but still marked by the morning. "I want Ruthie's diner contacted immediately," she said. "The security footage from 6:35 until the moment I was removed must be preserved. No edits. No gaps. No copies handled by anyone involved in this incident." Captain Hayes nodded too quickly. "Of course. I want the body camera status from both responding officers documented in writing," Naomi continued. "If either camera was off, I want the reason stated before noon." Whitaker's eyes shifted toward the floor. It was small but Naomi saw it. So did Hayes. "I want Officer Parker's statement taken separately," she said. "Not in the break room. Not after a conversation with Officer Whitaker. Separately." Parker, standing just outside the door, looked up at the sound of his name. His face was pale, but something steadier had entered his eyes. Hayes rubbed one hand over his mouth. "Madam District Attorney, we can handle this internally." Naomi turned to him then and the room cooled. "Captain, this department has handled things internally for years. That is why I had files on my desk before I had keys to my office." The words landed with quiet force. Whitaker looked at her now, really looked, As if the woman from the diner and the official in front of him were two people, he was only beginning to understand he had made the mistake of separating. "This does not have to ruin anyone," he said, his voice lower than before. It was not quite an apology. It was fear wearing the clothes of reason. Naomi held his gaze. "You poured a drink on a woman because you believed she was powerless. You removed her from a public place because she asked for your name. Then you wrote a report that made your conduct disappear." Whitaker swallowed. "I was wrong." The words came out thin, late, and surrounded by consequences. Naomi did not soften, but she did not sharpen either. That was what unsettled him most. She was not enjoying this. She was not performing revenge. She was placing each fact on the table where everyone could see it. "Being wrong is spilling coffee by accident," she said. "What happened this morning was a choice." Hayes looked toward the hallway, where two officers had stopped pretending not to listen. Naomi followed his eyes. "Let them listen. Let the walls hear it too." "Effective immediately," she said. "Officer Whitaker is to be placed on administrative leave pending an independent review. Internal Affairs will be notified. And I will request an outside investigator from the State Attorney General's office. Every prior civilian complaint involving Officer Whitaker from the last 5 years will be reviewed for pattern and suppression." Whitaker's face tightened at the word pattern. It was the word that changed a bad morning into a history. Hayes exhaled slowly. "That will make noise." Naomi picked up the manila envelope from the table. The seal was still intact. "Good," she said. Some rooms only change when silence stops protecting them. For the first time, Parker stepped fully into the doorway. "Madam District Attorney," he said, voice uneven but clear, "I will give a statement." Whitaker turned toward him, stunned. Parker did not look away this time. Naomi nodded once, not with triumph but recognition. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight slid through the narrow station window and touched the edge of Whitaker's badge, then Naomi's stained sleeve, making both visible in the same hard light. Justice had not arrived with shouting. It had arrived with documentation, witnesses, and one woman refusing to let a lie become paperwork. By the time Naomi Brooks stepped out of the Franklin Police Department, the rain had washed the sidewalks clean, but the morning had left its mark on everything it touched. The courthouse bell across the square struck 10, its sound rolling over the wet pavement, past the flagpole, past the parked patrol cars, past the windows where officers stood pretending not to watch. Captain Hayes walked beside her without speaking. Officer Parker followed several steps behind, carrying her purse and the sealed envelope with both hands, as if the paper had become heavier now that everyone knew what it meant. Naomi paused at the curb and looked toward the courthouse dome. She had imagined this moment differently. She had imagined a quiet oath, a firm handshake, maybe a few polite cameras from the local paper. Instead, she stood in the morning light with a stained blouse, sore wrists, and a town already whispering her name. Yet she did not feel diminished. The stain was not shame. It was record. It was witness. It was the first case Franklin County had handed her before she ever sat behind the desk. "Madam District Attorney," Captain Hayes said quietly, "I will cooperate fully." Naomi turned to him. His face looked older than it had an hour before. Not innocent, not absolved, but aware. "Cooperation is not the same as change," she said. "But it is where change can begin." Hayes nodded, and for once, he had no answer ready. At 11:30, Naomi took her oath in courtroom 2 beneath a carved wooden seal darkened by decades of dust and polish. Judge Merritt stood before her, silver-haired and solemn, while a handful of county employees filled the benches. Maggie Ellis sat in the back row, still wearing her red scarf from the diner, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her sat the young father and his little boy, who held a blue crayon like a flag too small for battle but brave enough for truth. When Naomi raised her right hand, the room grew still. The marks on her wrists were faint now, but visible. She did not hide them. Her voice did not tremble as she promised to uphold the law without fear or favor. Outside the courthouse, clouds broke apart, and sunlight spread across the square in slow golden pieces. By late afternoon, Naomi returned to Ruthie's diner. The bell above the door gave the same tiny ring, but this time the room did not look away. Maggie came from behind the counter carrying a clean mug and a fresh cup of coffee. Her hands shook just enough for the surface to ripple. "On the house," she said. Naomi looked at her for a moment, then accepted it with both hands. "Thank you for saving the footage." Maggie's eyes filled, but she smiled. "Thank you for asking like it mattered." Naomi sat in the same corner booth by the window. The old photograph of the courthouse hung above her shoulder. Across the room, people returned to their meals, but something had changed in the way they occupied the space. They sat taller. They spoke softer, not from fear, but from respect for what silence had almost cost them. Naomi lifted the cup. The coffee was hot, dark, and steady in her hands. Outside, Franklin Avenue glistened under the clearing sky, and the courthouse windows caught the sun like open eyes. No one asked her to move. No one claimed the table. No one pretended not to see her. For a long moment, there was only the sound of a spoon touching porcelain, the low hum of the neon sign, and a kind of justice so quiet that everyone in the diner could hear it.